Have you ever been dressed to the nines or waited for something for a blue moon? If you're puzzled by these phrases, you're not alone. These are examples of idioms. Idioms are fascinating elements of language that add color and depth to our conversations. They're phrases or expressions that don't necessarily mean what the words say. Instead, they carry a figurative meaning that's often specific to a certain language or region. For example, when someone is dressed to the nines, they're not literally wearing 9 items of clothing. They're dressed very nicely, often in formal attire. And if you've been waiting for a blue moon, you haven't been waiting for the moon to turn blue. You've been waiting for a long time. These idiomatic expressions can be quite puzzling, especially for those learning English. But fear not. Ready to dive in? We will explore some idioms, their meanings and how to use them. Let's start with the idiom to dress up. Does it mean to put on a costume? Not really. In fact, to dress up means to wear formal clothes or to dress very nicely. For instance, when you're going to the theater, you might say, "We should definitely dress up to go to the theater." Next up, we have "at last." This idiom is used when something finally happens after a long time. Imagine you've been waiting for hours for a train, and when it finally arrives, you could say, "We waited for hours and then the train arrived at last." Now let's look at "as usual." This phrase is used when something is typical or generally the case. If George is always late for class, you might say, "George is late for class as usual." Moving on to find out. This idiom is about getting information or determining something. For instance, if you want to know what time the airplane arrives, you could say, "Will you please try to find out what time the airplane arrives?" Next, we have "to look at," which means to give one's attention to something or to watch something. For example, the teacher told us to look at the blackboard and not at our books. Similarly, to look for means to try to find or search for something. If you've misplaced your pen and are searching for it, you could say, "He spent over an hour looking for the pen that he lost." Now, let's consider "all right." This idiom is used to express acceptance or agreement. It's like saying yes or okay. For example, "He said that it would be all right to wait in her office until she returned." Up next is "all along," which means all the time from the beginning, without change. For instance, "She knew all along that we'd never agree with his plan." We also have "little by little," which means gradually or slowly. For example, "Karen's health seems to be improving little by little." The next idiom, "to tire out," means to make very weary due to difficult conditions or hard effort. For instance, "The hot weather tired out the runners in the marathon." We also have "to call on," which means to ask for a response from someone or to visit someone. For example, Jose didn't know the answer when the teacher called on him. And finally, we have "never mind," which is used to tell someone not to worry about something. For example, when he spilled his drink on my coat, I said, "Never mind. It needs to be cleaned anyway." Now that you know what these idioms mean, it's time to understand how to use them in sentences. Knowing the meaning of an idiom is one thing, but using it correctly in a sentence is another. Let's dive right into our first idiom, "to dress up." This idiom is used when we talk about wearing formal clothes or dressing very nicely. For instance, if you're going to a fancy event, you might say, "I need to dress up for the gala tonight." Next up, we have "at last." This is used when something finally happens after a long time. Imagine you've been waiting for a friend who's running late. When they finally arrive, you could say, "At last you're here." Then there's "as usual," which is used to describe something that typically happens. If your friend is always late, you might remark, "As usual, you're late for our meeting." Now let's look at "to find out." This idiom is used when you're trying to get information about something. If you don't know when a movie starts, you might say, "I need to find out the movie timings." Next, we have "to look at," which simply means to give one's attention to something. For example, you might say, "Look at that beautiful sunset." Following this, we have "to look for," which means to try to find or search for something. If you've lost your keys, you might say, "I've been looking for my keys all morning." "All right" is another common idiom, used to express acceptance or agreement. If someone asks if they can borrow a book, you might reply, "That's all right." The idiom all along is used to indicate that something has been true from the beginning. If you knew a secret but didn't tell anyone, you might say, I knew all along. Little by little means gradually or slowly. If you're learning a new skill, you might say, I'm improving little by little. To tire out means to become very weary due to difficult conditions or hard effort. After a long hike, you might say, that hike really tired me out. Finally, to call on means to ask for a response or to visit someone. If a teacher asks a student a question, they're calling on them. If you're visiting someone, you might say, I decided to call on my friend. With these examples, you should now have a better understanding of how to use these idioms in your conversations.